Hi, so this is the video lesson for today's reading class. We've been talking about strategies to use when we run into words that we don't know in our reading. And, we've talked about how important it is not to go straight to a dictionary to look up a word, because that information ends up just going into our short-term memory. What we want is for new words to go into our long-term memory. And the way we do that, the way we get them to go there, is that we need to play around with them. We need to think about them, mess around with them, make guesses about them. We talked last time about one strategy for playing around with words rather than going directly to look them up, and that was using the context, the other words or sentences around the word, to make a guess. Today we're going to talk about a second strategy. Next class we'll talk about a third one. The strategy we're going to talk about today is using Greek and Latin word parts to try to make guesses about what words mean or what they're related to. So this, of the three strategies that we're going to use, this is the one that is the most difficult to use, because there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Greek and Latin word parts, and we really need to build our knowledge of them before they become very useful. And that's the work of years, frankly. But I've got some strategies, some websites you can use, some games you can play to start on the journey of building your vocabulary of Greek and Latin word parts, which over time will become more and more useful as a way to mess around with words, to play with words. First of all, let's talk a little bit about why Greek and Latin word parts would help us with English. Well, as you may be aware, English doesn't come, modern English doesn't come from one source. Many languages develop just from one source over the thousands of years. Like Spanish, French, Italian, they what are called romantic languages, not because they have anything to do with romance or affection or love, but because they come from Latin, which was the language of the Roman Empire. Romance, like Rome, romance languages. So those languages, like Spanish and French and Italian, they come directly from Latin. And because they come from one source, they tend to be fairly logical, fairly, what's the word I want? They're not a mess like English is. English does not come from one source. It comes from several sources, one of which is Latin. So originally, in the island that later becomes England, there were different tribes of people called things like the Celts or the Picts, and then after living in isolation there for millennia, they began to be successively invaded by other groups of people. One of the earliest invasions was from Northern Europe, from areas where various Germanic languages were spoken. And so these people sailed out into the sea to the west of Northern Europe, looking for other places to colonize or to explore. One of the places that they found was the island that later becomes England or Britain. And they invaded and conquered the people that were there. Some of the groups that did that were tribes, a couple of tribes, one called the Angles and one called the Saxons. And so they successfully invaded the island that later becomes Britain, and the language that they spoke, the Germanic languages that they brought with them, came to be used there and came to be called Anglo-Saxon, from Angles and Saxons, Anglo-Saxon. So this language, the first language that began to overlay the original languages of the Celts and the Picts and the other tribes, was Anglo-Saxon. It was a Germanic language. Okay, then around 100 AD, the Roman Empire began to spread all over Europe, and Roman soldiers also invaded into Britain, or what later becomes Britain, and their language was Latin. And Latin, going back 1,000 years, had been influenced also by Greek, because the Greek Empire covered the same area 1,000 years or so before the Roman Empire, something like that. I may have these dates a little bit wrong, but roughly. So the Latin that was spoken by the Roman soldiers began to influence the Anglo-Saxon language that was already spoken in this area. Now also at this time, the Roman Empire became a Christian empire. They were influenced by Christianity, and the monks and the church people at that time from Rome spoke also Latin. Latin was the main language spoken by the Roman Catholic Church that began to spread over the areas that were being ruled by the Roman Empire. Okay, so first we have the Celts and the Picts and tribes like that. They were influenced by the Angles and the Saxons, and the main sort of language of the area became Anglo-Saxon. Now you have Latin coming in as an influence from Rome and the Christian Church. And then finally, in 1060, well, not finally, but then next in 1066 CE, the William the Conqueror, who was from Normandy in northern France, came across the English Channel and invaded Britain, what later becomes Britain, and that brought French with him and his troops. And so French became the language of the upper classes, the rulers in the island, in this area, and the lower classes, the peasants, still spoke mainly Anglo-Saxon, and so English was affected then after Anglo-Saxon and Latin by French, which itself was influenced by Latin. So this explains all of these different influences on English, explain why English is such a mess, right? Because there are parts of English that come from Anglo-Saxon, there are parts of English that come from Latin and Greek, there are parts of language that come English that come from French, which itself was influenced by Latin. So all of these different influences make English a very messy, complicated language. However, it's important to us today to think about the fact that about 35 to 40% of English words come from Latin or Greek. So that's a lot. That's almost half. So the more we know about Greek and Latin word parts, the more able we're going to be able to do to make guesses about words that we run into that we don't know. Okay, I'm going to end the video here. We're going to come back and talk about it a little bit more.